Hello and welcome back to another lecture. In this lecture, we will learn how to use Terraform to launch an RDS instance. To complete this lecture, we will launch the RDS instance in the default VPC, so anyone can follow along. And if you want to learn how to use Terraform to create dynamic application in AWS, I will leave the link to the full course in this video's description. To start, the first thing we will do is create a folder for this project on our computer. So I want you to go to your desktop or any directory on your computer and create a folder for this project. I'm going to create the folder for this project on my desktop. So I'm going to right click here and go to New. Under New, I'm going to select Folder. Then I'll give the folder a name. I'll call the folder Launch RDS. Once you've given the folder a name, press Enter. Once you've created the folder, the next thing we will do is open this folder in Visual Studio Code. So next, I want you to open Visual Studio Code. Once you have opened Visual Studio Code, open your project folder in it. I'm going to select File, and I'll select Open Folder. Then browse to the location where you save your project folder. I save mine on the desktop, so I'll select Desktop. And on my desktop, my project folder is Launch RDS. I'll select it once. And once you select it once, click Select Folder. Once you've opened your project folder in Visual Studio Code, the next thing we will do is create the Terraform file that we will use to create the resource for the RDS instance. So the next thing I want you to do is create a Terraform file in your Explorer. To create a Terraform file in your Explorer, right-click anywhere in this open space and select New File. Then give the file a name, call it rds.tf. Once you've given the file a name, press Enter. Once you have created the file, the next thing I want you to do is use the link in this video's description to access the reference file I created for this lecture. This is the reference file that I created for this lecture, and in this reference file, I've included the resource type and arguments we need to create the RDS instance. The next thing I want you to do is select everything in this reference file. To select everything in this reference file, I want you to click here on line 1. Once you click once before the hashtag on line 1, scroll all the way down. Hold the Shift key on your computer and click once after the closing bracket on line 109. That is going to select everything in this reference file. Once you've selected everything in this reference file, right-click to copy it. Then let's go back to our Terraform file. In Visual Studio Code, paste it in your Terraform file. Once you have pasted the syntax in your Terraform file, scroll up. The first syntax on our Terraform code will allow us to authenticate with our AWS environment and also allow us to download the Terraform packages for AWS. To authenticate with our AWS environment, first we specify provider, and the cloud provider we want to authenticate to is AWS. Once we have specified the cloud provider we want to authenticate to, the next option is region, and this is the region where we want to create the RDS instance. For this project, we will create the RDS instance in US East 1. So for region, type US East 1 in double quotes. Once you have specified the region you want to create the RDS instance in, the next option is profile. And this is the profile we have configured on our computer that contains the access key ID and secret access key that we will use to authenticate with our AWS environment. In case you haven't configured a profile on your computer, I will leave a link to that tutorial in this video's description. For the named profile that I've configured on my computer, I called it Terraform User. So in here, I'm going to type Terraform User. Once you have entered the value for the profile, the next resource will create a default VPC in your account if one does not exist. Remember I said we will use the default VPC to complete this project, and this is the resource block that we will use to create a default VPC in our account if one does not exist. So on this resource, you don't need to change anything on it. Let's scroll down. Once we have created the default VPC, Next, we will use data source to get a list of all the availability zones in the region where we want to launch our RDS instance. Remember, for this project, we are using US East 1. So this resource block will get a list of all the availability zone in US East 1. Once we have a list of all the availability zones in our region, next we will create a default subnet in the first availability zone if one does not exist. So if you already have a default subnet in the first availability zone, Terraform will ignore this syntax. But if you don't have a default subnet, Terraform will use this syntax to create a default subnet in that availability zone. This is the resource type to create a default subnet, and this is the reference name I've given it. To create our default subnet in the first availability zone, we will use the argument availability zone. For the value of the first availability zone in our region, remember here we are using data source to get a list of all the availability zone in this region. So the first thing we will do is copy this. So copy everything here. Once you copy it, paste it here. Once you paste it, remove the quote, add a period, then remove the double quotes here, add another period, then come all the way to the end, remove the quote, add a period, and type names. Once you type names, enter bracket and enter 0. To explain what this value means, remember we will use data source to get a list of all the availability zones in the region. And when we get a list of all the availability zones, we are telling Terraform we want to select the first availability zone from the list. In coding language, the 0 we have entered in the bracket is telling Terraform to select the first availability zone from the list. The next resource will create another default subnet in the second availability zone in our region if one does not exist. Just like we did in this resource, this is the resource type to create a default subnet, and this is the reference name I've given it. Once you have entered your resource type and the reference name, the next thing we will enter is the availability zone argument. And for the value of the availability zone argument, when we get a list of availability zones in our region, we want to select the second availability zone. So to select the second availability zone in our region, we will do the same thing we did here. So let's copy our data source here, copy everything here, and paste it here. Then remove the quote, add a period, remove the double quote here, add another period, then remove the quote here, add another period, and type names. Once you type names, enter a bracket and enter 1. So what this means is when we get a list of all the availability zones in our region, we will select the second availability zone. The 1 means we want to select the second availability zone, and the 0 here means we want to select the first availability zone. Once we have created the subnets that we will launch the RDS instance in, the next thing we will create is the security groups for the RDS instance. To complete this lecture, we will create 2 security groups, and the first security group we will create is the web server security group. The reason why I have included the web server security group in this lecture is to show you how to properly configure your database security group to allow traffic from your web server. To create the web server security group, this is the resource type to create a security group, and this is the reference name I've given it. The first argument is name, and this is the name we want to call the security group. I've entered a default value that I called web server security group. If you want to change it, you can change it. The next argument is description, and this is the description we want to give this security group. And I have also entered a default value, enable HTTP access on port 80. The next argument is the VPC ID, and this is the ID of the VPC we want to create the security group in. Remember, we created our VPC up here. So what we will do is we will copy the resource type and the reference name. Once you copy the resource type and the reference name of your VPC, scroll back down and we will paste it here. Once you paste it, remove the double quotes between them, add a period, then come all the way to the end, add another period, and type ID. This is how you enter the ID of your VPC. The next argument we will enter is the ingress rule. And for the ingress rule, we have description, which I have entered a default value of HTTP access. For the from port, enter 80. For the to port, enter 80. For the protocol, enter TCP. And for the CIDR block, enter a bracket. And in double quotes, enter 0.0.0.0/0. Once you've entered the CIDR blocks, the next argument is the egress rule, and this is the outbound traffic. For the from port, we are going to enter 0. For the to port, enter 0. For the protocol, enter -1. And for the CIDR blocks, also enter 0.0.0.0/0. So you can copy what you entered here and paste it here. The next argument we will enter is tags, and for the tag name, we will call it Web Server Security Group. So you can copy the same security group name here and paste it under tags. Once we have created the Web Server Security Group, the next security group we will create is the Database Security Group. And to create the Database Security Group, this is the resource type to create a security group, and this is the reference name I've given it. The first argument is name, and this is the name of the security group. I've entered a default value that I called Database Security Group. The next argument is description, and this is the description for this security group. I've also entered a default value. The next argument we will enter is the VPC ID, and this is the ID of the VPC we want to create this security group in. Remember, we created our security group in the default VPC, so we can copy the value here and paste it here. Once you have entered the VPC ID, the next argument is ingress rule, and under ingress, the first option is description. Here I have entered a default value, and the next option is the from port. For the from port, enter 3306. This is the default port for MySQL. Once you enter 3306, for the to port, also enter 3306. And for the protocol, enter TCP in double quotes. The next argument is security groups, and this is the security group that our RDS security group will allow traffic from. This is the reason why we created the Web Server Security Group. So here, I want you to copy the resource type for the Web Server Security Group and the reference name. Once you copy it, come back down here. Under security groups, first I want you to enter a bracket. Once you've entered a bracket, paste it in there. Then remove the double quotes, add a period, then come all the way to the end, add another period, and type ID. This is the reason why we created the security group. I want to use this opportunity to show you how to configure your database security group to allow traffic from your web server. The next argument is the egress rule, and for the from port, enter 0. For the to port, enter 0. For the protocol, enter -1. And for the CIDR blocks, enter bracket and type in double quotes 0.0.0.0/0. Once you've entered your CIDR blocks, the next argument we will enter is tags, and for the tag name, we can call it the same name we called our security group. So copy the database security group name here and paste it here. Then scroll down. The next resource we will create is the database subnet groups, and this is how we specify the subnets that we want to reserve for our RDS instance. This is the resource type to create a subnet group, and this is the reference name I've given it. The first argument is name, and this is the name of the subnet groups. So here in double quotes, give your subnet groups a name, and you can call it any name you want. I'll call it database subnets. Once you've given your subnet group a name, the next argument is subnet IDs, and these are the subnets we want to launch the RDS instance in. To enter the subnets we want to launch our RDS instance in, first enter a bracket. Once you've entered the bracket, remember we want to launch our RDS instance in the default subnet in the first availability zone and second availability zone. So let's scroll up here. This is the resource to create the default subnet in the first availability zone. So first I want you to copy the resource type and the reference name. Once you've copied it, let's come back down. And in that bracket, paste it there. Remove the double quotes. Add a period. Then come all the way to the end, add another period, and type ID. This is how we reference the subnet in the first availability zone. Once you've referenced the subnet in the first availability zone, enter comma and space. Then let's copy the resource type and reference name for the subnet in the second availability zone. This is the resource type and reference name for the subnet in the second availability zone. Copy it, then come back down here. After the comma, make sure there's a space, paste it there. Then remove the double quotes between them, add a period, then come all the way to the end, add another period and type ID. This is how we reference the subnet we want to launch the RDS instance in. And for this tutorial, we have reserved the subnet in the first availability zone and the second availability zone for the RDS instance. The next argument we will enter is description. And for the description, in double quote, type subnets for database instance. Once you've entered the description, the next argument is tags. And for the tag name, we can use the same name as the subnet groups. So copy the name from up here and paste it here. Then let's scroll down. The last resource on our template will launch the RDS instance. This is the resource type to launch an RDS instance, and this is the reference name I've given it. The first argument is engine, and this is the engine for our database. For this tutorial, we will launch a MySQL database. So in double quote, type MySQL in lowercase. The next argument is the engine version, and for this tutorial, we will use version 8. So in double quotes, type 8.0.31. The next argument is multi-AZ, and this is if we want to create a standby database in the other availability zone. For this tutorial, we won't create a standby database in the other availability zone. So here we will type false. The next argument is identifier, and this is the name we want to call the RDS instance. So here in double quotes, give your RDS instance any name you want. Once you've given your RDS instance a name, make sure you type the name in lowercase, and you can use underscore or hyphen. The next argument is username, and this is the username for our database. So here in double quotes, enter a username for your database. Once you've entered the username for your database, the next argument is password, and this is the password for your database. Here in double quotes, enter a password for your database. Once you've entered the password for your database, the next argument is instance class, and this is the instance type we want to use for our database. For this tutorial, we will use db.t2.micro. So here in double quote, type db.t2.micro the way you see me type it on the screen. Once you've entered the instance class for your database, the next argument is allocation storage. For allocation storage, enter 200. The next argument is db subnet group name, and this is the subnet group for our database. Remember we created our subnet group here? So all you have to do is copy the resource type and the reference name. Once you copy it, come back down here and paste it here. Then remove the double quote here, add a period, then come all the way to the end, add another period and type name. The next argument we will enter is the VPC security group IDs. This is the ID of the security group for our database. Remember we created our database security group up here. So copy the resource type and the reference name for your database security group. Once you've copied the resource type and reference name, come back down. And before you paste it here, enter a bracket. And in that bracket, paste it in there. Then remove the double quotes, enter a period, come all the way to the end, add another period and type ID. Once you've entered the ID of your database security group, the next argument is availability zone. And this is the availability zone you want to launch the database in. Remember, we are using the first and second availability zones. So here, you can pick any availability zone you want. It doesn't matter. I'll pick the first availability zone by copying this. Once you copy it, come back down and paste it here. The next argument is DB name, and this is the name you want to give your database. So here in double quotes, type it in lowercase, give your database a name. Once you have given your database a name, the last argument is skip final snapshot, and this is for when you delete your RDS instance if you want to create a final snapshot. For this lecture, we are not going to create a final snapshot when we delete the RDS instance we create. So here we will type true. This is all we need to do to write the syntax to create an RDS database. The next thing I want you to do is save your work. So here I'm going to select File and select Save All. Once you have saved your work, next we will open the terminal to create the RDS database. So right-click on the RDS file and select Open in Integrated Terminal. Once you open the terminal, the first command we will type is Terraform init to initialize with our AWS environment. Type Terraform init. Once you type Terraform init, press enter. It is now initializing with our AWS environment, and we will give it some time to initialize. And there you go. We have successfully initialized with our AWS environment. Once you have successfully initialized, the next command we will type is Terraform apply to create the RDS instance. Type Terraform apply. Once you type Terraform apply, press enter. Once you type Terraform apply and press enter, the first thing Terraform will do is show you the plan, and the plan contains the resources that Terraform will create in your AWS account based on the resources we have written in our Terraform file. So once you have reviewed the Terraform plan and you are happy with the plan, scroll down. Here, Terraform is showing us the plan, and it is going to add 7 resources. Here it is asking us, do we want to perform these actions? We are going to type yes and press enter. And there you go. Terraform is now creating the RDS instance in our AWS environment. It will take some time to create the RDS instance, so I'll pause the video and wait for Terraform to create the RDS instance in my AWS environment. After 4 minutes and 35 seconds, Terraform has successfully created the RDS instance in my AWS account. So next, if we go into our AWS account, we should see the RDS instance there. I'm going to go to the AWS account. In your AWS account, type RDS in the search box and select RDS under Services. On the RDS console, click Database Instances. And there you go. You can see the RDS instance we just created here. If you select it, under Connectivity and Security, you will see your RDS endpoint here. And on the Configurations tab, if you scroll down, here you will see the master username we entered in Terraform, and here you will see the database name we entered in Terraform. Next, if we select Subnet Groups, in the Subnet Groups, you will also see the subnet group that we created with Terraform. This is how you use Terraform to create an RDS instance. Now that we have verified that Terraform has successfully created the RDS instance, the next thing we will do is run Terraform destroy to clean up our environment. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. In Visual Studio Code, to clean up our environment, we will type Terraform destroy. Once you type Terraform destroy, press enter. When you type Terraform destroy and press enter, the first thing Terraform will do is show you the plan. And here, Terraform is showing us the plan that it would delete 7 resources. Terraform is also asking if I want to delete all the resources. I'm going to type yes here and press enter. And there you go. Terraform is now deleting the RDS instance, and it will take some time for Terraform to delete it. This is how you use Terraform to create an RDS instance. If you have any question on this lecture or there's any part you don't understand, please leave your comments below. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye.